so much, Paul. I appreciate the introduction. I also NRTA am presenting. This is a core course offering at our conferences when we are able to come back together. The Art of Lease Abstraction has been taught over almost back to the origination of the conference by several speakers, and I've been able to be handed the torch for the last few years. So I'm always excited when people attend this course because I know some of you are very seasoned, but I always get feedback that you may have picked up a nugget or two that you can take back and apply to your job. So I hope that will be the case today. We are doing this in a 2-session series. Today I'll be focused on the art of abstraction, the critical data that we should be capturing, the advantages and challenges of lease abstraction, requirements for abstracting, and critical data to abstract. And then our next session will focus more on data review, how to make sure we're maintaining data accurately, and how to take that data forward in the new ways of managing lease data. So with that said, I'll go ahead and get started. I don't read many slides, but I really like this slide, and that is the definition of what is lease abstracting. I think about myself when I'm introduced to people and they ask me what I do, and I say I'm in lease administration. We do lease analysis and lease abstraction, and people's eyes glaze over because they have no idea what I'm talking about for the most part. So the art of lease abstracting is the ability to read pages of legal information, then interpret and summarize the critical information. The summary is obviously the highlight of abstraction. Information such as critical dates, detailed financial information, and paraphrase sentences of provisional information. So we are taking that legal document, passing it through interpretation, and then picking up the critical data that we need for our organization. The key to abstraction is that the data must be accurate, it must be consistent, and it certainly must be complete. So what are some of the advantages of lease abstracting? Why do we do it? Well, obviously, critical date management is huge in our lease admin teams and across the organization. So managing those critical dates when our leases expire, when they renew, when we may need to take some other action based on options that we have. Manage lease events. So we're constantly challenging the lease data. Maybe there's a co-tenancy breach or an exclusivity breach, or maybe the occupancy has dropped in a building. So we're always looking at that lease data to understand what our obligations and our landlord obligations are. Financial and corporate reporting. Obviously, for those of you that are publicly traded, you have been in the throes of FASB 842, IFRS 16, and that has made us much more in alignment with our folks over in the finance and accounting department, as many of them become more reliant upon the lease data, the critical lease financial data that you're abstracting on their behalf. Portfolio analysis, so not being able to just look at one lease and its critical data, but to look across your entire portfolio of leases to make educated and analytical decisions as you look at the real estate landscape that you currently have. Easy access to information. So no one wants to sit and read a 62-page lease to find out the critical information they're looking for. So by lease abstracting critical and important data, it allows the reader to be able to locate and understand that information quite easily. And then strategic planning. Obviously, in the days ahead and with COVID, Paul and I were just talking, you know, who is planning and how do we plan? Well, having the most robust lease data that you have will help at least make some business decisions or plan to start making some business decisions as we look at the future. Paul, I believe we have a polling question for our audience. How
there
many
it is.
Team members in? Yeah, perfect. So I'm curious to get to know you all out there. So how many team members in your company abstract lease data today? 1 individual, 2 to 5 resources, 6 to 15, or over 15? So I'll give you some time to make your selections. Okay. Wow. All right. Well, I will tell you the first answer of one. It is my big statement at NRTA and always has been. You should absolutely have more than one person trained in the art of data abstraction for your organization. That has to have a supporting person. Obviously, that is a huge role that you fill, but I would highly recommend that you find a peer or another member, if possible, to help support you in your lease data abstraction efforts. 2 to 5, that looks good. We've got the majority of our team living in a good size. 6 to 15, 22%. That's getting large. Now that could mean a large portfolio, a lot of leases to abstract and maintain. And then over 15. So I'll go the counter side and say, you know, you really want to look at the headcount managing the abstracted data. Obviously, the greater the pool of resources abstracting, the greater the risk of inconsistency across the group, right? So as long as you have good training methods and good instructional writing, perhaps having those larger groups works for you. And obviously, if you have a huge amount of leases, you have to have the resources. But great results. Thank you all for participating in that. We'll have some more throughout the presentation. All right. So the next, obviously, we talked about the advantages, but what are some of the challenges we face trying to abstract critical data? Dates and more dates. It seems like every time I see a new lease, we're creating even more dates that I didn't even know could exist in trying to come up with contingencies as to when a lease will begin. So managing all of these dates is certainly a challenge. No standardization. A lot of you obviously are in the tenant role, and that means that you must succumb to a landlord's documentation or their paper for their leases. And if you don't have that landlord throughout your portfolio, that means all of your leases are papered differently. And so that can be quite cumbersome in the abstraction process. Going global, right? Now we've introduced a lot of international leases that are translated. Translations, just like the movies, things can get lost in translation. And then sometimes we are then have data at risk that's not actually in alignment to the intent of the original non-translated lease. So that is a complexity that's come our way as well. Concessions. Obviously right now in the midst of COVID and trying to understand what opportunities you have for rent deferment, for other what things to leverage that you could work to find some way of rent relief is challenging because we didn't necessarily know to prepare and abstract this type of data on the front end. Non-real estate leases. In meeting with a lot of you at the conference, this is now also, because the word leases in your title, fallen under your purview, and now we have a whole nother set of rules and regulations to abide by with our non-real estate leases, our fleets, our computers, etc. I won't cover non-real estate lease abstraction today, but I do know it's a challenge added to your plate. Obviously, I mentioned this earlier, the new lease accounting standards. For you that are private, they are still coming. Thank you for the deferment, but we do know that at some point your data will have to be the supporting subledger of information to lead to your financial reporting obligations. Percentage rent, always a challenge, especially right now, but just how to manage that and track it and line it up with your POS systems can be a challenge. And then contingencies, going back to our dates and more dates challenge, there are so many contingencies in a new construction project, and you have to be able to manage all of those dates, know who's going to provide those dates to you, and keep those dates updated, as well as keeping these contingencies in front of you to make sure you're not going to miss something that could cause a delay in getting the store or your office opened. And then complex options. I mean, more and more complexity in all of our leases continues to grow, but I'll use kick-out as an example here. I mean, in our shop, we've seen kick-out options where the landlord has a measuring period, the tenant has a differing measuring period, and each year those options have to be tested. It can become, one, a nightmare to just track that level of data, but then to also manage those options each year. So let's talk about abstracting requirements. And Paul, do I have another polling question here, or I've got one more, I think, perhaps?
It's coming up in a couple slides. I can put it up now if you'd like. Yep, there it goes.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, let's do that. So the good question here is, as we get into abstracting requirements, how many data fields do you have on your abstract form today? So we're going to start talking about what a good abstract form should look like, but on average, how many data fields do you have on your abstract form? 0 to 20 fields, 21 to 50 fields, 51 to 100 data fields. That's getting up there, or even over 100 data fields that you are required to populate during lease abstraction. Give you a few seconds to respond. Okay. All right. Well, these numbers look good. 0 to 20. You know, that could be. I know we have a lot more focus, as I said, on the accounting end, and in fact, we're seeing some accounting teams taking over lease abstraction. So that may be more of a financial abstract, hyper focused on that critical dates, dollars, and options form. 21 to 50, this is the average range that we typically see. That is about the same in our shop, where you're getting all of that critical information, but you're also adding some provisional data, and we'll walk through examples of that later. 51 to 100, again, that's getting up there, but again, it depends on your business, how many people within your organization are relying on the abstract. That will certainly lead to more data fields requiring population. So that makes sense depending upon all the things that you're capturing. Over 100, whoa, that is a lot of data. And I hope that if that's the case, that aligns with the person that has over 15 resources in their shop doing abstraction, because that certainly is a lot of data to manage and maintain. But great responses, and I think the averages are where they should be overall. So thank you for your response on that one. All right. So when I work with customers, they often ask, what should be on our abstract form? I don't even know, what I should consider. And so I ask them to go back to their organization and ask a series of questions. So who will use the information? Obviously, if you're abstracting this great data and it's critical information to the organization, you want to know everyone that could benefit from the information that you're going to abstract. So asking that question to the organization. What is critical to abstract? Well, clearly we know that dates, all of the financial information, and any critical lease options that we can't afford to miss are certainly important. But there may be business-specific things that are also considered critical to your organization. What reports will be required by the consumers of the information? So whether you're using Excel today or a database and you're looking to advance or enhance your abstract form, you have consumers of your information using some of your data, and they may be reproducing it in reports, or you may be producing it in reports. And now we need to make sure that we replicate or improve that reporting. So we want to make sure we take a look at all of the reports being used in the organization. What can be maintained consistently? So we don't need to necessarily account for every single provision within a lease if it is a hyper one-off type of provision. So for example, you have a standard retail lease, and in one lease alone and a series of 500 leases that you've abstracted, hazardous material is brought up. I wouldn't recommend that you then decide that for all 500 leases you start abstracting hazardous material. You want to focus on that, maybe call it out as a special note, but you don't need to maintain something like that because it's so inconsistent throughout your portfolio. And then this is the big question. Who will maintain the abstract? As I've talked about, we want that refined resource group that has the expertise in lease abstraction. What is that expertise? Well, they have to understand legal compliance and understand legalese in the legal documents. They have to understand the accounting and the financial aspects of the lease. They need to understand critical dates and critical date management. So this is quite a unique set of skills that come together to be a strong abstracting analyst. So you need to identify within your organization where's the best fit for that, and that those people are highly trained in maintaining the abstracted data once you've decided on all of the answers to these questions. So let's talk about what documentation and tools do we start with for lease abstracting, right? So we're not even talking about the critical data we're going to focus on. These are just the tools we need to be effective lease abstraction analysts. And the first is obviously access to all of the legal documents. It's understanding the commencement date, and sometimes that's very clear because we have a commencement date agreement or some exhibit or letter that supports that. But in some cases, that may be a chase that we have to go through the organization to find. We may have to meet with construction or facilities to try and get all of those contingency dates aligned so we know when the lease commences. Possession date. This has become a very important date for our friends over in finance, so we need to also have a place to track that so that we understand why the financial terms are going to align to that. Contact information, obviously having a clear understanding of who the parties are and how to reach out to them, contact them with questions, payment, etc. And then the abstract form itself. What is going to be our tool? It may be a database, it may be Excel, it may be a Word document. Obviously, you know, our recommendation would always be a database where the data is controlled, it's secured, and that you have access and appropriate access to those within the organization. And then abstraction instructions. This is very critical. I want to make sure that everyone has abstraction instructions in front of them. It really drives how you keep up that consistent formatting of all the lease data. So we'll walk through some of that as well. So once we've identified the documentation and the tools, we now need to understand how are we going to format all of the data, right? So if you're in a database or in an Excel spreadsheet, are we going to have a date format? Is it going to be a numeric field? Are we going to design drop-down lists with key important data that we can consistently select and track? Is it going to be text fields? And if it's text fields, we need to think about, is there a content size limit? And is there a character limit? So we want to understand how much data do we really need to capture? Are we going to really work on paraphrasing and kind of keeping it easy and simple? Or do we want to get more verbatim captures in some cases, for example, like exclusive use, where I would really want to see that verbatim data rather than someone's interpretation? And what I'm showing you here in this, this white box section is just an example of looking at each field and understanding that, you know, this is a drop-down box, this is a date field, and including that in your abstracting instructions. So when you go to train a new resource, they won't struggle to understand how to populate these fields via their correct format. Then I always suggest that your abstract should be broken down in reasonable sections and try and order it as leases generally flow, right? So if we think about a lease document, typically the first thing we're going to see is the location, the premises, the address information. Then typically the next thing we do is we get into the term. It starts to talk about the critical dates, when the lease will begin, will it will end, how long the term will be, if there's any lease options and the notification requirements. That's typically going to be more on that first front 2 pages of any lease. And not always, but typically. The next is going to be financials, rent and related charges. So again, rent is critical, but we also understand we've got CAM, tax, insurance, promo fees, marketing fees, et cetera, that will also need to be considered. Percentage rent in our retail world, security deposits. How does our rent escalate? We need to understand that and be able to share that with our finance teams, because that's helping them through their understanding of whether or not under lease accounting policy these leases should be included. Options, right? We need to understand all of the lease options that we have, not just our critical ones, renewals, auto renewals, terminations, but relocation, contraction, expansion. All of the options should be included in your abstract, and it should have its own section. Tenant improvement, construction allowance, certainly important to track and understand. And you'll notice that I have some data here highlighted in bold. And that is because those bolded items do impact our friends over in finance. They are highly interested in this data to understand how they're going to apply whatever is the appropriate profile or accounting treatment for these new leases that you're getting into your database using this new abstract structure. So now I'm going to walk through some examples of abstraction. Obviously, we don't have any time today to go through field by field and demonstrate how to abstract a lease. And we typically, if we're on site, we'd have some handouts for you, but I think I can walk through this and give you the impression of what we're talking about when we talk about lease abstraction. So I'm going to focus on those critical dates first, and I'm going to use commencement date as my first example. So typically when I read a lease, I'm going to see that there are multiple sections potentially that could deal with commencement date. Sometimes it's real straightforward, but I think you guys know in more cases than not, it can be kind of an Easter egg hunt to figure out where the date will be. So in this example, I have section 1.2, which defines the term of the lease. So I at least know it's going to be a 5-year lease term, but I do not know when the rent will commence yet. So that takes me down to section 3.1, which helps me distinguish all of the contingencies that have to occur for a commencement date to be established. In this example, it states that it shall be the earlier when tenant opens, or the selection of one of the 3 opportunities to show that the premises was almost completed. It's made available to the tenant, that the tenant's work letter and permitting has been done. So there's many contingencies here that could occur that could also create the commencement date if they occurred earlier than the tenant actually opening in the premises. So here is a great example of multiple dates that we have to be tracking and understanding where we get them from to help determine commencement. The next section of our lease that helps guide us is 3.2, and in this section it's talking about the definition of a lease year. So if this lease works out to commence on any other day than the first day of a calendar year, that's going to become our lease year. So the example being, let's say our lease commences in August, then August and every 12 months thereafter will become the lease year for any escalations this lease may have. So that was a great legal example of how dates are clear as mud and how we have to really work on tracking those contingency events to understand when we can commence. I always recommend, if at all possible, you want to implement a commencement date agreement in your organization or a commencement date letter. Even if you cannot get landlord to sign it or acknowledge it, at least you putting the dates to paper and sending to landlord, it expresses that these are the dates we are going to be working from. And I had seen a great example of a commencement date agreement long ago from one of our customers. And what I loved about it was that not only did it set the rent or lease commencement, but it restated every single date that would drive that lease. So it stated each rent increase date, each lease option date, each lease option notice date if it were a renewal. And it really just vetted out all of the dates that would be a part of that lease for its entire lease term. And you know, it sounds like a lot of work, but at the end of the day, you're still updating your database at the time you get that commencement agreement. So I really think there's value in getting on the same page with landlord as soon as possible to make sure that you're in alignment on your date selection. Some other critical dates to mention. Yeah, Paul.
Kelly, we have a quick question. Do you have a good example of a summary letter between the landlord and the tenant to formalize these critical dates?
I do, and I will be happy to share that. If anyone would like that, if you'll email me, my email will be on at the end of the session. I will be happy to share that with you.
Great.
Super.
Great.
Yeah, happy to do that. So just some examples here you'll see of critical dates that come up, right? So we talked about possession, but certificate of occupancy can be a trigger to start a lease. Substantial delivery date, store opening, obviously in retail is a big one. And then some other dates we recommend you track: lease agreement date, right? That's going to be the date when the lease was executed, or when the preamble expresses in the lease when the lease is going was entered into, if you will. And that can sometimes serve as possession if possession date is unclear. Lease commencement, rent commencement, again, when does my rent increase, lease expiration, lease years, and option notifications. These are all critical dates in our definition. And as I mentioned at the onset of the presentation, every day there seems to be new leases that are coming into play. So this is certainly not a complete list, but I think the most critical that we see consistently. And for our corporate friends that are participating, we add another layer of complexity in the corporate world, and that means that sometimes we can have a lease that starts to take on multiple suites, and this could happen in retail as well, but you're taking on multiple suites that have differing terms, but they all are amendments up under one lease agreement. So now you've got multiple dates to track, all related to this one legal obligation. So that's something that comes up as well. So being able to manage all of those dates is certainly important. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to lease options. And just as I did before, I'm just going to kind of look at some legal lease data and how we would take that information and concatenate it down to be what's critical to know without having all of the lawyer speak in there, right? So we'll start with looking at some legal documentation. So here at the top, we have Article 4. It's an option to extend. It's going to provide that we will have 2 separate successive options. It provides that it's going to be for 5 years. And then it goes into the notice period. In this case, I can give up to 180 days notice, but no less than 60 days notice of our intent to renew or vacate. And then in a subsection, this is on the first page in this example, it gives me the financial responsibility for the first 5 and the second 5-year term. So again, I'm having to read through the entire lease. I'm not just hitting search on options. I'm having to read all of the data to conclude and put together the story that is about this renewal option. So what do we consider critical for a renewal option when you're capturing data through lease abstraction? The number of options that you have. So in the example I just gave, we have 2 options. What is the term length of each option? 5 years. What's the notice period in our example? 180 days, but no less than 60. And those are days. We're not converting those to months. We're using the actual lease language, 180 days and 60 days. What's the financial obligation during the option term? And again, our friends over in accounting are now interested in applying their policy that says, are we reasonably certain to exercise this option? Now, that may not be your responsibility to flip that trigger, but it is going to be an impactful decision for the balance sheet if the company has set policy that these 2 5-year options should be included in lease recognition. So just to highlight there on that. Each option should be abstracted separately with all of its dates and conditions. So an example of what we would want to see, here we have very easy to use, remember, easy access, easy to read, one renewal, its begin date and end date of the option 5-year term, when we can give notice, when we have to give notice by at the latest, and then the actual quick recap of the option. First of 2 5-year options upon not more than 180 days nor less than 60 days written notice at, and we include the rental amount for the option. Get the information very consistently, and we keep it in that format, very easy to use and read. Now, again, we've used renewal as an example, but there are a plethora of option types out there in our leases today. Renewal, auto renewal, obviously the converse of having to give notice, not giving notice unless you want to get out. Termination, again, you'll see these are bolded. These are important to our friends in finance because they are a part of making policy decisions if you're going to assume that you're taking them or not. Relocation, expansion, contraction, right of first offer. We see a lot of folks don't track this. It's pretty important. Even though you may not want to take any action, if landlord fails to provide you notice, you have some remedy there. So you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on that. The right to purchase, kick out, I talked about that from a retail perspective. Some new ones we're seeing our clients track, required remodel. This is where the tenant now has an obligation at a specific date. By year 5, tenant will make updates and improvements at a budget of. So we're seeing that type of language, and it's connected to a date. So the risk is if you don't remodel by the date that you should be tracking, you could be placed in default, right? Nobody wants that. So keeping an eye on required remodel, especially if it's date specified, is important. We also have clients tracking contingency dates as options because there may be remedy. If landlord fails to hit a contingency date, you may have an out of that lease or a rent relief period or something like that. So contingencies we're seeing those be treated as options just to keep that reporting view on them and make sure we're managing them more effectively. And then I put term break here. Obviously, as we're international, we start to also use different words around the world that represent, in this case, a possible termination. But our friends over in the UK use term break. And so you may start to increase your option types based on the location of the lease. Okay, moving on to financial data. Obviously, we've talked seriously about rents and options, but you also have other financial obligations under the lease, as you all know. So I'm going to use a CAM operating expense example again. So here's some lease language. This is section 2201 of a lease, and it goes through and determines for us all of the required inclusive data that must be tracked. And that is listed here. Now, we do not recommend that you take that level of detail and abstract it. It should be cited, but obviously doing a verbatim capture of this ad nauseum is just too much. We know there will be inclusions in CAM, just as we know there will be exclusions in CAM. And if you want to focus on anything and you're into desktop auditing, you're probably more focused on the exclusions than the inclusions, right? So you want to make sure that if there's any very specific exclusion that you think puts you at risk or landlord of failing to comply, you may want to abstract that. But again, I would always abstract where you found in the lease, the section, document section and page, where these exclusions and inclusions can be found. The next, and these can also be very long. I'm sure some of you have seen, these can be pages long in detail. So again, why we would not recommend abstracting them as much as citing them and looking to them when you need them when you're doing audits. The next section of the lease here defines pro rata share, how we're going to establish your percentage over the denominator. And again, that may be a struggle. Some leases are good about providing it, but in this case, you'll see this lease has language that says on the day of January for the calendar year for which any calculations is being made. So there, you know, the possibility with this lease is that their GLA could expand or potentially contract over time. So we want to make sure we're keeping an eye on that GLA. And again, it may be a different group, a different stakeholder in our organization that's managing that, facilities, construction, but we need to make sure we're always challenging the denominator. And then the payment terms, obviously, you know, when do we have to reconcile? What do we expect? Those details are important to understand as we abstract the operating expense data that we want to capture. And then, additionally, we have audit rights, and that's very important. If we have the right to audit landlord, we want to make sure we're capturing that language. And then, of course, if it's a new lease, we need to understand what our original estimated payment will be, and if there are any caps on that payment and any challenges to that, or if there's a base year for our operating expense clients over in the corporate world. So you can see there's a lot of data to be read through as it relates to just this one topic, operating expenses or CAM. So a lot of reading, but we need to read the lease. We don't need to search and hunt and peck. Read the entire lease, and you'll come across these various sections as you're reading through. Once you've done your reading, then here's what we believe is critical to capture. Yes, that first year's estimated payment is certainly important, not just to capture it, but to also run it out as an expense item for your rent payments to be accurate. Understanding how and calculating your pro rata share, listing out those capped expenses. For our retail friends, is there any anchor contribution from a retail standpoint that we need to know about? We want to track that. Base years, if there's a base year in play for corporate, we want to make sure we're tracking the base year and the dollar amount if available. Minimum occupancy, if there's an occupancy cap or requirement for retail, we need to be looking at that. Gross ups for corporate, right? So if the vacancy is down, and we're all seeing that today, right? Is there some sort of gross up consideration we need to make in our operating expense reconciliations? Administrative fees, management fees, very commonly to pick those up and understand what those are, or if they're not applicable, also important to know. Do we have audit rights? And again, CAM exclusions and inclusions, but our recommendation is cite, do not copy and paste them into your abstract.
Kel, I believe we have
So
another question up.
We do. So I'm excited to understand who out there is performing reconciliation or desktop audits for your organization. So yes, you are, and that's a part of your responsibility, or no, that may live with another group or even a third party. I'll give you a few seconds. Yes. Wow, look at that, 76%. That is great. And I know it's a tremendous amount of effort, no matter how many leases you have. And no could be, as I said, an outsource or different group or third party. But I think those of you that are saying yes, you all know how valuable the accurately abstracted data around operating expenses is for you and trying to make your job easier when it comes time to reconcile. Great. Okay. So we've talked about the critical data, and I really think that those highlighted previously, before we move to what I call provisional data, really are critical to any organization, and they should be included on any lease abstract. And now we start to move towards more lease abstracting provisional data, right? So it's not date sensitive, but it lives in your lease, and you should know that you have these rights. And so the example I'm going to use today is assignment and sublease, right? Everybody wants to understand, do I have a right to sublease the space? And in this case, you can see there's quite a bit of legal language around what this lease can do. And in this case, there are fees associated with even requesting the right to assign, or to even request to the landlord $1,000 just to ask the landlord if they would provide consent on an assignment. And then if you lease or sublease that space at a higher rate than landlord was receiving from you, landlord gets to come back and take some of that from you. So a lot going on here under assignment and subletting. But again, wouldn't want to do a verbatim here. We want to help our reader out to get to the simple nuggets of what's important when we read this. So after you've done your reading, you go back and evaluate for critical data, and that is, does the tenant have a right to assign or sublease, and are there any exceptions to the stated rule, any consent requirement, etc.? Does landlord have the right to recapture, include any instances where tenant is released from liability? Now, I highlight this because here's the thing. Generally, you're not going to get released from a sublease or an assignment obligation. It's very rare. But if you do, you certainly want to note that. So if landlord attempts to come back at you because of some sort of default by the subtenant, you can prove out that you have no responsibility. Any fees, obviously, are important to understand for those that are going to be reading this, to understand if they're going to go make the ask, what are we costing our company. And then here's a nuance that I haven't mentioned yet, but I certainly recommend it for any data field that is formatted in a text way that you could add a note. So if there is no provision in the lease that speaks to assignment and subletting, then what I want you to do is put something in that field that lets the reader know, I did look at this, but there's no data in the lease to speak to assignment or subleasing. So in our shop, you'll see our example here, we use no lease provision. I've seen other shops use silent, no provision, whatever it is, but make sure the reader clearly understands, oh, okay, this wasn't missed. It simply does not exist in the lease record.
Kel, before you go on to repairs, we have another question.
Yeah, let's
when you
do
take
it.
on, this is a live one. When you take on a new client and you find that many or any leases are not fully executed, do you ask them to go back and receive these documents, get them executed?
In our shop, we will communicate to our customer that we have found a partially unexecuted document, but we would continue with abstraction, and the client would make the request back for that fully executed version. However, if it's fully unexecuted, we would stop. We would submit to customer and say, we need you to please go get an executed document. Yes, that would be our best practice recommendation for sure. At least if you have one party, sometimes landlords take a little while to get it back to you, but you've signed it, that the terms have been agreed to. Certainly you want to call it out and keep it in your tickler, though, to make sure you're getting that fully executed back at some point.
Great, thank you. I agree, 100%.
Excellent. All right. Okay. I hope everybody's having a great time. We're talking lease abstraction. It's a super exciting topic. And here in Atlanta, it's raining and dreary. So I hope I've got some energy for you. I hope you're enjoying yourself so far. So let's go on to obligations, repairs, and maintenance. Now, the lease can be packed full of this, right? And it's where we start to define what the tenant is obligated to repair and maintain versus what the landlord will pick up. And in some cases, that landlord may pick up the repair, but it's going to be fed back into operating expenses or CAM, or they may indeed own the reimbursable obligation for the repair. So we want to make sure we're tracking when do we have to be responsible to make the repair and who's responsible to pay for the repair. What we do for our customers is we take a very clean approach to this, because I say to our customers, what's ringing your phone, right? I know you all get calls from the field or from property management asking you who's responsible for the roof or roof's leaking. And you do not want to have to go and pick up the 62-page lease and read through it to quickly understand who's obligated or not. So what we recommend is the critical data is who's responsible to make the repair, who's responsible to pay for it, who's responsible, is there a cost threshold, meaning at some point after a certain dollar amount, the responsibilities shift or change. And then finally, are there preventative maintenance requirements? Really important, because if you're not adhering to your preventative maintenance requirements, you could be placed in default and put a lot of other things at risk. So tracking that preventative maintenance and warranty items is important. So the typical types of repairs and maintenance items we recommend at a minimum get tracked: HVAC, building systems, the parking lot, retail glass door facade, janitorial for our corporate friends, roof structure. These are the big ones, and typically where landlord could contribute or not, and may or may not be included in CAM. But I have worked with customers who have developed quite a thorough list here because they know what rings their phone. So this list should be flexible to what works best for your organization. These are just some examples. And then what we want to see is this very clean presentation. So I have a list of types of repairs that I would recommend you consistently abstract for. And if they don't exist in a lease, we're going to use our no lease provision. and we're going to explain who's responsible to make the repair, who has to pay for it. If there's any special nuances, we can add a comment, and then we're always using our citing. Document section and page is critical on any lease data you're capturing. So if the reader wants to get more engaged with the data, they can get to the lease, get quickly to the section, and get that additional detail. And I think we have one more question, Paul.
There it is.
Awesome. And this is my last question. Thank you all for participating. But I think this is a really important question, and I'm going to briefly wrap up with instructional writing. But do you today have documented detailed abstraction instructions that are reviewed and kept current? So this is going to be a field-by-field, descriptive, detailed instruction, what goes in the field, maybe even an example of what should go in the field, the format of the field. So I'll give you a couple seconds to answer. Yay, very impressive results, 61%. I'm so happy to see that. That is fantastic. And I hope that some of that is you going to NRTA and getting smart from all of the classes we offer there, but that's very good to see. For those of you who don't, you know, obviously it's certainly a recommendation we make, we use in our shop, and it really leads to consistency across the data. So when I'm running that report, I don't know who abstracted the lease. That's the goal, right, in that consistency. So one of the things we do is here's some examples of detailed instructions. So for every single field, there is an instruction. And what you can do if you don't have data for the field, or if you're abstracting something and it seems like there may be a discrepancy or a question about the data. So you can see here, we're just telling the abstracting analyst what to do as they come across each field. Some databases will even allow you to embed this instructional help field by field. Or again, you can at least have it on your dual screen environment, have your instructions up while you're doing your abstraction. And finally, just another wrap up, I like the current lease expiration date example we have here. We're actually showing you, you know, here's how we would look at this, or term comment down here at the bottom. We give an example of what we're looking for from a content standpoint if we had a month-to-month lease. And so anything you can do to help your analysts understand and consistently present data is certainly beneficial, and we do believe that data instructions are a big factor in getting that consistency. Obviously, we'll talk in a couple of weeks about the next steps, and that is how are we going to review all of this and ensure that it's accurate and complete. And with that, I believe I have come to the end of my presentation. I will only again stress, read the entire lease, all of the amendments. Do not hunt and peck for data. Read the lease, highlight it, get the core nuggets of information that are critical to your organization into your database, repository, Excel document, whatever it is you're using. But please read everything, and you probably will read it 2 or 3 times to get everything completely accurate and consistent. And with that, Paul, I'm wrapped up. Any questions out there?
Take a breath. Take a deep breath. Kelly, we've answered the questions that have come in so far. But again, as you can see on the slide, Kelly has given all of us her email address. So if you have questions after, please feel free to email her and she'll get back to you. This was an excellent presentation. And keep in mind, folks, that you'll get a link to this later this afternoon, and it'll be on the professional library by tomorrow. And if you have an abstractor or somebody you're trying to train, what a great way to sit them down and let them go through this presentation that was obviously very well done. A couple of things, a reminder that we will have part 2 on November 10th, which is maintaining lease data quality, which is just one more step in this whole process. We hope you can all join us. Again, Kelly, thank you very much. there's a reason why you present for 12 years at the NRTA conference, and it was just an excellent, excellent presentation. The last thing I wanted to mention to you is please complete the survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. It's important. One of the questions, or two of the questions, is how can we maintain credibility with the NRTA? How can we help you in this tough time with COVID? Number one, and number two, if there's any topics that you would like to see us cover, please send us a note and let us know about it. The last thing for you members, our Board of Governors elections opened up this morning. You can vote for another eight or 9 days. Simply go on to the members homepage of the of our website and cast your vote for the 3 people that you'd like to see on the board. With that, this will be the end of the presentation. Again, we thank you very much. Kelly, thank you. Tremendous job. And we'll all talk later and hope to see you on the 10th of November for part 2. Have a good day.